Thank you all for coming here. This is, I start out with disclaimers. Yeah, this is to acquaint upstate New Yorkers with our literary heritage. I found over my life as a writer and a reader that there's a kind of an attitude in the arts upstate that if it didn't happen in New York City, well, it must not matter very much. You're kind of in their shadow, and I wanted to acquaint upstaters with our literary heritage, which is very rich. And this is my disclaimer: I'm not a historian. I teach on a college level, but I'm not a scholar. I merely a writer in search of my tribe, the ancestors of my tribe. Now, most upstaters probably know that Mark Twain is buried in Elmira, New York. And but who is this person?
Daughter.
Yeah. And who's this guy? Who's this guy? You're going to be really surprised when I tell you who he is. From Buffalo. Now, the reason I'm starting with I'm going to start with Rochester, and maybe by starting in Rochester, I'm going to be telling you about some people that you probably already know about, but maybe there'll be some surprises there too. This is Paul Bowles, and the reason why I'm starting with him is this is how I got started. The poet Robert Darling at Ithaca College told me that Paul Bowles is buried in the Finger Lakes. And Paul Bowles, you might be acquainted with his work. You might have read his novel, The Sheltering Sky, or you may have seen the movie, The Sheltering Sky. He was a novelist, but he was also a renowned composer. This is one of his books there. It didn't work very well on the screen, but Betsy and I went looking for his grave, and we found it in Lakemont Cemetery down a back road in near Glenora, New York, in the wine country. Those are there's wine vines or grapevines behind him. The reason I was so surprised that he's buried there is because he famously lived most of his life in Tangiers, He really didn't. He only came back to the United States on rare occasions. He didn't have a lot of good memories here, but I wanted to investigate why he was buried here. And it turns out that although he lived in New York City, he was born in New York City and lived in New York City as a child, his grandparents had a summer home in the Finger Lakes, and he spent his summers up here. There was also a family plot. And so when he was buried, he wanted to be buried in the family plot in Glenora. That is his wife, Jane Bowles, that's buried there. She is not actually there. She died some years before he did in 1999. He died in 1999 at the end of the year. And she died some years before, and she's buried in Spain, but the kind of relationship that they had, they didn't live together very much, but they were very devoted to each other, and that's why her name is on the stone, even though she was buried in Spain in the 70s. Now, this is of course, Frederick Douglass, who was buried in Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester. He is, by the way, he is the most photographed American of the 19th century. Not Abraham Lincoln. Well, actually, there aren't that many pictures of Abraham Lincoln, but he was photographed again and again and again. He was an exciting guy to photograph. This is a book that I think everybody should read. This is one of his two autobiographies, I think. This starts with his life as a slave in Virginia. How he made it to the north by hook or by crook. He got up here. He had to, once he was in the north, he had to flee to England because after he published this book, the notoriety, the people that owned him in the south could come back north and reclaim him. So he went to England, and some sympathetic people there bought his freedom. And this is his grave. He's buried with two wives. Their names are on the stone there. And it's really easy to find his grave once you get there because there's signs pointing to it. quite a well-beaten path. Most people don't think of Susan B. Anthony as a writer. She's a suffragist. She's the most famous suffragist in the United States. But she was the writer and one of the writers and editors of the 4-volume Woman Suffrage, along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Matilda Jocelyn Gage and 2 others, I believe. I've never been able to find those books. They must be in the local history room at the library, but I've never seen them. I can't claim to have read everything by all the authors that I have.
Another disclaimer.
I would have never finished this project. But she also was very easy to find. And, they were friends, of course, she and sometimes they were friends, she and Frederick Douglass. This is after one of the, I think this was in the election day 2016, and a few hours later it was just covered with stickers. They don't want you to do that because it's not good for the stone. So now they have a plastic cover, and you can stick everything you want on it on election days. And it's a very decorated grave. People look after it, and people leave mementos there. Now, this person is Lillian Wald. I checked, and the people at the cemetery, in the administration of the cemetery, aren't apparently aware of who she was. She was a very important person. She grew up in Rochester. She was born in Ohio, I think in Cleveland or Cincinnati, but she grew up in Rochester, and she decided to become a nurse. So she went to nursing school at a nursing hospital in Manhattan. And on graduation day, a young boy came into the hospital and talked to her and said, "My mother is bleeding. Please help." So she and another nurse followed him, and they went into this tenement house, an old smoky tenement house like you might see in Lewis Hine photographs. And they did find the woman who was hemorrhaging and saved her. And this is her grave in Mount Hope Cemetery. She is also an author. Oops, that's not her book. She wrote a book called The House on Henry Street because this was her aha moment when she met that woman and stopped her bleeding. She started a tenement house, a settlement house in Manhattan. It's called the Henry Street Settlement House, and people could come, the poor could come to the settlement house and get medical care. If they were hungry, they could get food. It's still in business, as a matter of fact. She's long gone, but it's still in business. And the book is hard to read because it's full of stories like I just told you. She also started the first non-religious visiting nurse service in the world. And her grave is easy to find if you read my book. One of the wonderful things about my book is that it not only tells you about where they're buried, but I give pretty explicit directions on how to find their graves, because I had trouble finding them myself. I don't want you to go through as much trouble as I had. But her grave, she's buried next to her sister, and her grave is usually very well tended by people that admire her. In the summer, they're fresh flowers, in the winter, they're plastic ones, but there's always something there marking her grave. Now, one of the only person in this book of mine who is not a writer is Edward R. Crumb, but I couldn't leave him out. I wanted to include him because Edward R. Crumb was the individual who Kurt Vonnegut modeled his character Billy Pilgrim after. Now the reason, what happened was Edward Crone went to high school in Brighton. He went into the army in World War II. He was captured in Belgium and was a prisoner of war in Dresden, worked in the slaughterhouse, I guess. One of his co-prisoners was Kurt Vonnegut. Kurt Vonnegut survived. They both survived the bombing, the carpet bombing of Dresden. But Edward Crone died sometime shortly after that. Somebody said he died of a broken heart, but Kurt Vonnegut, I think, felt that he just died of malnutrition because he was giving his rations away to children. And when he came to Rochester for the arts and lectures, the people who, Susan and Rosemary, who had the arts and lectures, told him that Billy Pilgrim is buried in Rochester. And he said, oh no. He said, he's buried in Dresden, I helped bury him. We buried him in a paper suit because there was nothing else to clothe him in. And they said no, that they had found out that his family had had him exhumed or disinterred and brought to Rochester and reburied in the family plot. And that's his grave there.
Wow.
When they brought Kurt Vonnegut to the cemetery and they waited at the gate while he went in and sat with Billy Pilgrim and had a few cigarettes and talked. And when he came out to the car again, he said, that closes World War II for me.
Wow.
So he's the only non-writer. I'm sure he wrote essays in high school. But it's hard to find a picture of him, you know. I couldn't find a picture of him that I could digitize. And this person is also in Mount Hope. Her name is Adelaide Crapsey. Anybody know who she is? She was a poet. And her father was a renowned Episcopalian minister. She was a poet who only published 1 or 2 poems in her lifetime, but she worked very hard at it. She went to Smith. She came down in 1906. She contracted tuberculosis, and but it seemed to go away, and she began to think maybe she had been misdiagnosed. She went to Smith College, got a teaching job there, as a matter of fact, thinking that she'd been misdiagnosed, but then it came back. And in a few years, she died. She went to a sanitarium in Saratoga, but died at home here, I believe, in Rochester. Now, her father was a minister who went off the reservation, so to speak. He preached that the miracles and the virgin birth and all of that, the stories of Jesus were probably not true, but that one should simply follow his teaching. Well, that got him in trouble with the Episcopal Diocese, which was in Batavia at the time, and it covered a large area, and he was put on trial for heresy in Batavia. It was not only national news, it was world news. It was heresy in this day and age. He was defrocked. She took the train down to Batavia every day for the trial. There's some people have said that she was so distraught over that it hastened her death, but I don't think that's true. Because she died in 2014. Well, the trial was in 1906. Her birth wasn't in 1906, I'm sorry. She had gone on a walking tour of Wales with her father. So she was fairly healthy after that, and I think her death had nothing to do with that. But she is apparently the only American to have invented a poetic form. All other poetic forms used by traditional forms by poets have their genesis somewhere else. But she invented a form called the cinquain, and it was based on or inspired by the Japanese forms of haiku and tanka. It's a 5-line poem and 5-line stanza, and she was way ahead of her time in my view, because she knew how to use line breaks for half commas, for slight pauses, and that is something that only came along with the modernists, who come along somewhat after her. So she was way ahead of her time. I'm going to go to, that's her grave.
Wow.
It's the footstone, you know. And that's her father, that's her mother, Adelaide, and that's her father, Algernon. He wrote a book too, called The Last Heretic. It was his version of events, I guess. Yeah. Now, but this is how she got published. You might be aware of the architect Claude Bragdon. Claude Bragdon was a very forward-thinking, almost mystical architect in Rochester. He wrote books too. We'll get to him. But he had a publishing company of his own. It was called the Manna Press. You know, manna like a manna from heaven. And his second wife, his first wife died. His second wife was a spiritualist. And she told him one morning that she'd had a dream that Adelaide came to her and had come to her and told her, I have a book of poems that should be published. And so they went to the Crapsey home. They said, yeah, yes, here they are. And he published them, and it's still in print. That book is still in print. She also wrote a book on prosody, which came out somewhat after that. But that was how Claude Bragdon got involved. This is the tomb, as it were, of. Am I moving too fast by chance? Okay.
No.
This is Lewis Henry Morgan. Lewis Henry Morgan was also in Mount Hope. I haven't left Mount Hope yet. Still waiting around there. This is. He was a railroad attorney in Rochester, and he became interested in Native Americans, or Indians, as they weren't called Native Americans then. He was very interested in the Iroquois. He was especially interested in the Seneca, and he wrote a number of books. He went often to the reservation, which is now the Tonawanda Reservation, which is just inside the border of Erie County. And he wrote numerous books, several books. Whoops. He wrote a number of books, and they actually about the matrilineal system of families, about co-ownership, and of just about everything that their tribe did, actually influenced Marx and Engels. They read his books, and that's where he's buried. If you enter the cemetery on the north end, it's a very short walk there. It seems to be getting a little dilapidated, but I understand there are people who are restoring that.
What cemetery is this?
That's in Mount Hope Cemetery, right on Mount Hope Avenue, the cemetery that crosses with Elmwood.
Right.
Yeah. Now we're leaving Mount Hope Cemetery. This is Louise Brooks. She's buried elsewhere. She was a very famous silent film star, and she helped popularize the bob haircut that became the kind of the flapper haircut. She wasn't the only one, but she was very famous and very sought after. She worked in Hollywood for a while. She started out as a Ziegfeld girl in the Follies, and found her way into acting. After being in Hollywood for a while, she went to Germany and made films with the German director G.B. Pabst. And in fact, her most famous film, Pandora's Box, was a Pabst movie that she was in. She made 2 movies with him and another 1 or 2 movies there, and then came back to Hollywood. Pabst begged her to stay, but she wanted to go back. She didn't like Hollywood either. When she didn't survive the changeover to sound very well. She didn't, like a lot of silent film stars, changing over to sound, their voice just wasn't right, but in her case it was she just didn't like it. And somebody asked her why she left Hollywood, and she said, "I have 700 reasons, and they're all good." And this is her book. This is her only book. Now, how she came to Rochester, James Card, who was the film curator at the Eastman House at the time, was visiting people he's a cinephile. He was visiting people in New York, and he was talking about Louise Brooks, and they said, "Well, she lives right down the street." And he couldn't believe it. So he went down and found her and brought her back to Rochester. She was writing scholarly works on film for peer-reviewed journals on cinema. And so he brought her to Rochester, found her an apartment, and told her, brought her to the Dryden Theater, showed her her old films, and said, "These are all at your disposal. I want to help you." So she continued to write. She wrote this one book, Lulu in Hollywood, and it's still in print, and it's still regarded as one of the best books on the silent era. It's not scholarly per chance, but it's her time in Hollywood. As I say, it's still in print, and she lived on Goodman Street, between University and East Avenue, in one of those apartment houses. She lived in there. Her writing career was cut short because she got arthritis and couldn't type, and she did not want to dictate, so she stopped writing. She died in 1984. There were a lot of people visited her. A lot of movie people still came to visit her. In fact, this writer Kenneth Tynan wrote the introduction to this publication of her book, which is originally was in the New Yorker, and it's a very well-known essay. This is where she's buried, in Holy Sepulchre, up on State Street on your way to the lake. The Catholic cemetery, on the right there's a cemetery, and on the left is the big one. If you go in there and you go to the office, they'll tell you how to find her. I've been there many times. There's usually somebody has left something there. This time somebody left some roses, and as you can see they kind of dried up. But there's a lot of mementos are left there. Henry Clune. I'll bet you a lot of you know Henry Clune. You may have known Henry Clune. Henry Clune was a reporter in Rochester, and he wrote a lot of books. One of his novels was called By His Own Hand, which was a thinly disguised biography novel in novel form of George Eastman. The movie rights were bought for it, but it was never produced. The books of his that I really like are this one, The Rochester I Know, and I Always Liked It Here. They're really good books. They're a really good picture of what Rochester was like in the 20s and teens. He lived to be 104, I believe. He lived in Scottsville. And he was, that was back when people didn't live in suburbs and drive. But he lived there, and he drank martinis every day. So I thought of maybe switching from wine to martinis, because I'd like to live to be 104. But he was a wonderful guy, apparently. And this is his grave on Marsh Road, the cemetery on Marsh Road nearby here. He's buried there next to his wife, Charlotte, and his parents. His wife, Charlotte, was an Olympic swimmer, and they met in New York City, and they got married a few days later. Can you believe in a love at first sight? It happens all the time. Arch Merrill. His books are all over the place. I've gone into used bookstores and found a lot of them. They're thin books and quick reads, and I've met people who have owned all of them and have read them many times. some people called him the poet of Upstate. I wouldn't give him that, but his they're good books. They're books about history and folklore of Upstate. His first book was called River Ramble, and what he did was he went to the he went down to the mouth or the source of the Genesee River, just over the border into Pennsylvania, and walked it all the way up to the lake.
Wow.
Alone. He got rides along the way. But here's a guy in street shoes and puffing a cigar, and he's 49 years old. I would say that's pretty good. All that walking was pretty good. Yeah. And this is his grave. This is Arch Merrill. That's his wife there, and that's their daughter, Marion Merrill. She was retarded, and in those times, sometimes families kept them out of sight, which was her fate.
And where is he?
Pardon me?
Where is he?
Oh, I'm sorry, yes. He's in what's called Brighton Cemetery. It's also called the Dutch Cemetery because some of the first people in that cemetery are Dutch. And there had been a Dutch Reformed church there. Where it is, if you go to East Avenue Wegmans and just go over the expressway and turn left, there's a little short street there, and you could throw a stone to the end of the street. It's so short, and you can find him in there. Yeah. It's a nice little cemetery. I wouldn't mind being buried there myself. But at one time, the Erie Canal went right by there. So I think the church burned down, and a lot of the records went with it. So there's a lot of records of who's buried there are lost, unfortunately. Now this is Claude Bragdon, who I told you about, architect and mystic. He wrote books about reincarnation. He wrote books about theosophy, and of course he was the architect of a lot of his work survived. The Universalist Church downtown Rochester was one of his buildings. He built the train station that they, in all their wisdom, tore down. That was an architectural marvel. And a bunch of other places. If you ever go to Writers and Books, the Literary Center in Rochester, it's an old precinct station, and he made that one. And a lot of other buildings outside of town. But he got into a dust-up with George Eastman about the design of this Chamber of Commerce, and he left. He went to New York City and spent the rest of his life in stage design and lighting. He was big on lighting. He was probably the inventor of the light show. He set up he was very interested in electronics and electronic lights, and so he created this light show in Highland Park, and you could drive your car or buggy through it, and it was quite a show apparently, and with lights broadcasting all over the place. And he took it on the road. He took it around the country into Europe. And there's still light shows around. And they probably owe their genesis to Claude Bragdon. But he is buried, this is one of his books, More Lives Than One, about reincarnation. He's buried in Pulaski, New York, just a little north of Watertown. There's a family plot there. That's his grave. He's the architect, so his is the one that's leaning. It's just a little outside of town. Pulaski's an interesting little town. It's like Watertown, it burned down, and a lot of it is rebuilt. But there's large sections that are on the in the historic register. This person is Jane Roberts.
There's one right here.
Right here.
In the front.
Right on your
Oh,
podium.
thank you. This is Jane Roberts. Jane Roberts was from Saratoga, and her second husband, she got married and divorced quite young. Her second husband was Earl Butz. No. I'm sorry. That was Earl Butz was the Secretary of Agriculture. How did that get into my head? I don't know. Her husband was Robert Butz. Yeah. She married Robert Butz, and they wanted to become writers. So they moved to Elmira and got an upstairs of a house with two adjoining apartments. And they decided they were going to settle down there and be great writers. However, all of a sudden she started having these spiritual experiences. This person, this Seth, the spirit named Seth was speaking to her. That's the idea. And he started transcribing it. The kind of philosophy that Seth was speaking through her, if you want to believe that this is the way it happened, I think we'd call it New Age today. It's kind of a mix of Buddhism and other liberation philosophies. And she became quite famous. She wrote a number of books on Seth, and they were bestsellers in paperback. Many years ago, when I worked at the Liftbridge Bookshop in Rochester, we had all her books, and people bought them. Someone told me once that she was his Jesus. But she had people visit her in Elmira from all over the world, people that you'd recognize, like Deepak Chopra, and I can't remember the name of the guy that wrote Jonathan Livingston Seagull, but visited her. But whether or not you buy into her Seth thing, she evidently was psychic. She evidently she was evidently at least telepathic, because people would walk into her apartment and she'd know all about you. Yeah. But she died young. She had a disease that overcame her, and she died. And where is she buried? Furnaceville. You know where Furnaceville is? Not very far from here. It used to be, Furnaceville is, if you go to Ontario, the town of Ontario, the area north of Ridge Road was Furnaceville, and it was because they found iron ore there, and they did a lot of smelting, and the sky was orange and all night long. And there's nothing there now except the Rod and Gun Club and a few, garage sales. And a cemetery, really. It's a beautiful area. There's wonderful houses up there. And it's all town of Ontario now. And they're buried there. There was a Butts family plot there in that cemetery, and that's why she's buried there and not in Elmira with Mark Twain. John Gardner. At one time, if you showed a picture of John Gardner, everybody would know who he was. He was a best-selling author. He is famous for the novels Nickel Mountain, Sunlight Dialogues, and the novel that's probably immortal is Grendel. It's the telling of the Beowulf saga from the perspective of the monster. His books are still in print, but 100 years from now, I think Grendel will be the book that'll still be, people will still be reading. He's from Batavia. I knew his parents. His parents and I were breakfast partners at one time, and I never met him. Every time I went to their house, he had either just left or he wasn't there yet, and I was terrified that I knew him, because to me he was like Thomas Wolfe or John Dos Passos or somebody of that ilk, And he died in a motorcycle accident down just south of near his home, south of Binghamton. He was teaching at SUNY Binghamton at the time, and he died on Thursday, I believe, and he was supposed to be married on Saturday. And I went to his funeral. That was on Sunday. And his poor fiance, she was just crushed. This is his book, Sunlight Dialogues. It's set in Batavia. It's I think a great psychological novel. And this is where he's buried in Grandview the Grandview Cemetery in Batavia on the east end of town. This inscription, "All he spoke or cast was mysterious and holy," was lifted from a letter that he wrote to someone. It's not out of one of his books. That's his mom and dad there, whom I was breakfast partners with. And he was famous for these long white hair that he had. And one day I went over to pick them up for breakfast, and there was this white stuff blowing across the yard. And his mother said, "That's the author's hair." This was in April, no, this was in June. And she said, "We gave him a haircut on the porch yesterday." And she said, "I wish he'd have cut it in April, then the birds could have made nests of it." Yeah. This is Mary Jane Holmes, a romance novelist of the 19th century. When I say romance novelist, I don't want to put her in a league quite with the romance novels of today, the ones you see with the light on in the tower and some half-dressed cookie. Her novels were, romance like maybe Emily or Charlotte Bronte's novels were romance. And she took on a lot of the issues of the day. Immigration, abolition, and women's suffrage. She addressed those in her novels. And she lived in Brockport. She was from Massachusetts. She lived in Brockport because she married a Brockport lawyer. And she was one of the most popular novelists of the 19th century. Maybe the second or third most popular woman novelists of the 19th century. And, whoops, that's wrong. This is one of her books. All her books are in print online. It's really hard. If you find a hard copy, they are either out of a used bookshop or something. I think you could get hard copies online probably. I have a bunch of them, and they're e-books. If you go to Brockport to the Morgan Manning House Museum, they have all her books. Seymour Library in Brockport has all her books. They're not circulating; they're for you to sit there and read. This is her grave. It's on High Street. I lived about 3 blocks from this cemetery. I never knew it was there. It's another short street, and if you go there,
That's in Brockport.
yeah, in Brockport. The big cemetery in Brockport is Lakeview. That's just north of town. This is the little one, and this is her husband. This is Mary Jane Holmes, and that's the Celtic cross that they're buried. Those are their footstones. It's a little cemetery, well tended, I guess, in terms of they keep the grass mowed and stuff. But the road in there is like a lot of broken up cement, so you might want to just park on the street and walk in, I think. This is A. Poulin Jr. He was a poet. He was one of the foremost translators of the French-German poet Rainer Maria Rilke. He was an anthologist. His anthology, that's his selected poems, was the most widely used textbook on contemporary anthologies of contemporary American poetry in college classrooms. It's not anymore. It's kind of run its course, but it went into 8 editions eventually. And that's his selected poems. He's a fine poet. He's a wonderful poet, a wonderful translator, and he was my friend. He founded the publishing company Boa Editions, and he hired me as a editorial assistant back in 1985, and I worked there in two different stretches. I left to become a reporter for a while, and then came back and I was managing editor with him then. And after he passed away, I became publisher. But he rescued me in a sense because, you know, a lot of my life before I met Al Poulin, I was working in factories and warehouses and not all that happy with things. And he all of a sudden, when I met him, I found myself in the company of poets. And I realized that I could do other things than the kind of bull work that I was doing. He rarely told me how to do something. He just told me to do it. And the first book that I printed the spine upside down, and he wasn't upset. He wasn't upset. And it was a book by the famous poet Robert Bly. I screwed that one up, but it's a real collector item. This is his grave. Now, am I running out of time, Vicki?
No, we're good.
Okay, this is his grave in Lakeview Cemetery in Brockport. It's the most common name of a cemetery in New York State I found is Lakeview. And then on none of them that I went into was a lake visible. Any of them. Wonderful name. That is one of his poems there. I can't really read it there, but he was only 58 when he died. He had some bad habits. He had emphysema. He had going on and on. And that is the painter and printmaker and etchings maker Robert Marks passed away a couple of years ago in Rochester, made that. Now I promised you I'd tell you who this guy is. This is Franz Stryker, and he's the author of The Lone Ranger. He lived in Alden, New York, near the end of his life, and he started The Lone Ranger when he was on a Buffalo station, and they used to have a lot of drama on radio then. And then he moved to WXYZ in Detroit, and they were running The Lone Ranger there on the radio, but the owner of the station, George Trendle, offered him a better job if he would sign over creative rights to The Lone Ranger, and he did. Now I wonder why he did it, but I think, you know, it was 1932.
Yeah.
He had a family, and he wanted a better job. He had no idea what was going to happen because George Trendle resold those rights for $4 million later. But he still wrote books, wrote the Lone Ranger and Tonto books with his name. If you go on YouTube and you find the old Lone Ranger television programs, it does say George Trendle. He also wrote the Tom Swift boys books, and he wrote The Green Hornet, and he wrote Sergeant Preston of the Yukon, which was one of my favorite programs when I was a kid. And if I'd known, see, I grew up in Ithaca, if I had known that the author of The Lone Ranger was only 20 miles away, I'm sorry to say this, but I show this to young people in Lone Ranger.
What was his name?
His name was Franz Stryker. And
Stryker?
Stryker, yes, Franz Stryker. And this is his grave. It's not out of molded steel bullets or silver bullets. All his family have these identical crosses, which worries me. Yes?
Is he from Strykersville?
No, I don't think so. I've never made that connection.
I'm from Sheldon.
You're from Sheldon.
Strykersville.
I don't know, maybe I should look into that. It's very possible. It might be a relative.
Yeah.
Anything I've read about him that didn't mention that. But when I was a kid, I got sent to Bible camp, and it was on his farm. after he died in 1962 in a car accident, and his wife turned the farm over to a church group. So I was sent to Bible camp around Columbus Day one fall, I think it might have been 1966 or so. And I realized that when they told me this, and they said, now that barn over there was one of those elongated chicken barns. He wrote his books in that. So that was also the girls' dorm. So while everybody was out on the ball field, I opened the door and I went back and I found the area. It was supposed to be the far end by the windows is where he wrote, and I just wanted to stand there. If I'd gotten caught, they never would have believed what I was saying. Like a Dharma transmission or something I wanted to. And it worked. I'm a writer. I couldn't understand why everybody wasn't. Oh my! Yeah, he was moving the family to Eden, New York, which is where that is. And part of that process, he got into a car accident and he died. So they never actually. I don't know where they actually moved. Okay, this is Canandaigua. Give me the high sign when it's time for the stop. This is Austin Stewart's grave. Austin Stewart was also a slave in Virginia, but he was about a generation earlier than Frederick Douglass. I think even a little more than that. It was in the 18th century, end of the 18th century. And the plantation owner was a bad gambler, and he lost his plantation, so he took all his slaves and said, we're going north. And they walked all the way to Sodus Bay.
Oh my God.
But when they got to Sodus Bay, some of the slaves just kept walking off. And he tried to whip them, and they whipped him. They found out. So he tried to make money by renting them out to farms. But New York State had and by the way, slavery was legal in New York until 1827. If you rented out a slave, he was automatically free. There was a manumission law that covered that. And so he taught himself to read. He was caught with a book once and roundly beaten, and a book thrown in the fire. But he wrote an autobiography. It's much more. Frederick Douglass is a very formal writer, but this man was even more formal. And I think if you read his book, you can see that he taught himself assiduously out of a grammar book, because that is the way he learned to write. And he had a market in Rochester on West Main, I think about around where just over the river, the area where the county offices are in that area. And he wrote a book. His book was originally published in Rochester, and it's called 22 Years a Slave and 40 Years a Free Man. He's pretty well known in Rochester, and at least among people interested in history. So it's Austin Stewart. That book is very available. Now, kids don't know this guy either. But this is of course the man, Rod Serling, and Rod Serling, writer of a lot of the scripts of the Twilight Zone. He also wrote a lot of television plays that were like for Alcoa and the drama that they used to run on regular television in those days. Then he started the Twilight Zone. He wrote probably about 2/3 of the scripts for the Twilight Zone, and he hosted it. You probably remember, because you were allowed to stay up a little later when it was on. And I didn't realize, but if you look at if you go on YouTube again and watch the Twilight Zone, you'll see it's Cayuga Productions, and that's because he lived in Ithaca, where he taught at Ithaca College, and they had a summer home right just up the lake what is it now?
Interlaken.
It's a little town of, I forget.
Bolton? Trumansburg?
Around in there. No, it's north of Trumansburg. And there's his grave.
Wow.
It's in Lakeview Cemetery.
Of course.
I challenge you to see a lake, a big lake in the sky, maybe. But Rodman Serling, he was born in Syracuse, grew up in Binghamton, and is the author of many, many television scripts and plays. Requiem for a Heavyweight, you might have seen that. That was a television play, and it became a movie with Anthony Quinn later. This is one of the most decorated graves of any author. And you're probably noticing by now that most of these authors have rather humble gravestones.
Yes.
But people, somebody left him a pack of cigarettes, which is what killed him.
Yeah.
He lived in Ithaca, and he had a heart attack, and he went to, I don't think it was his first one, he went to Tompkins Hospital there, and so they sent him to Strong for open heart surgery. On the way, he asked the ambulance to pull over and let him have a cigarette. But he died in recovery. So
What cemetery is that?
that is Lakeview Cemetery in
Interlaken.
Interlaken. Thank you. That's it. Yeah, Lakeview Cemetery in Interlaken. One time though, I saw a stone there, and it said "Hi, Dad." So it was from one of his daughters. One daughter wrote a wonderful book about him. One of the things she was fighting is this idea that he was a tortured, creative guy. She said, yeah, he was a creative guy, but he was also a wonderful family man. And this is Charles Jackson. You may have read the book or seen the movie Lost Weekend. That was his book. That's the book that made him famous. He was a raging alcoholic, which is what eventually killed him. But the Lost Weekend is I would say, a classic, a contemporary, or a 20th century classic. It's one of the best books on addiction. He used to go on tours for Alcoholics Anonymous, giving temperance talks and that stuff, but he often didn't hold up on those trips. Okay, that's his book. And I'll stop after this. But this is his grave in the cemetery in Newark, New York, just a little east of Rochester, and he's buried here. This is his sister and brother, and that's quite a story. His sister and brother were killed in a car accident or a train at a train crossing. His brother was probably about 6 years old. His sister was a teenager, and they were laid out in the casket together. Her lying on her side, and he with his head on her arm as though they'd fallen asleep together. And that's the way they were buried. Yeah. His father left home after that and never came back, and which is a little bit like his life afterward. He was a devoted dad when he was home, but then he died of a combination of alcohol and I think Valium in New York. But he wrote several books, but none of them ever really got the legs that Lost Weekend. And by the way, that movie by Billy Wilder got best film and best actor for Ray Milland. Okay, I'll answer questions now. I'll try to.
How come you didn't do Mr. Easton? George Easton?
George Eastman?
Yeah.
To the best of my knowledge, he wasn't a writer, was he?
No.
No. Well, that's why. He was an interesting guy. There's a lot of interesting stuff about him. Yeah. Any others?
So when did you start this project? And
2015.
Okay.
Yeah, 2015. That's when I found out about Paul Bowles, and I began to realize, this is a big subject. I started out as a blog, and for a while, and in fact, I gave a couple of talks here on my blog, and then Syracuse University Press got interested in it. So,
Thank you. Very good.
Thank you.